From Battlefield Studio Alpha, welcome to the Wartime Leadership Podcast, where we explore what spiritual resiliency looks like from different perspectives. We often focus on the physical, emotional, and social areas of resiliency, but too often we neglect the spiritual pillar. Now, this looks different for everyone. We will be exploring what spiritual resilience looks like in the lives of our guests, who are people from all different walks of life. I'm your host, Nathan Coy, and today's guest is Max Friedman. Max, sir, it has already been an amazing conversation between us. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks for allowing me to tell whatever story I have.
Before we actually got started, Max and I were having a really good conversation, actually already leading up to this. And I have been amazed because this story is very, very special to me, given my family's history and past, and a very, very big changing point in my perspective. And so I can't wait for you all to hear it, to get going. However, we do have to start with 5 simple questions, Max.
Okay.
They're simple, I'm telling you.
No, I need simple. Okay.
If you won $1 million, what would you do with it?
I would think about who I could give it to, who could need it more than me, and find that person or that organization that could make the best use of it.
See, that's what makes you special, Max. Already.
Mm.
What is your favorite athletic activity?
Running. I don't know if I'm running away or running towards something, but I'm running.
You're running towards, away, and around.
Right.
What should I know about you that I would never think to ask about?
I guess what you should know about me is that I have mimicked in too many ways my survivor family past. And I don't think you would, if you talk to me, I don't think you would know that because I tend to be somewhat cynical, but pretty upbeat. And there's a lot inside.
Yeah, there's a lot that you're working through or continuing to go through.
Even though I'm 72 now, if I have time, there's a lot more to be done.
Absolutely. I mean, I do know that you often look at yourself as being, what is it, the second generation
Yeah,
Holocaust
it's a
survivor.
second generation. Yeah, they call kids of people who survived the Holocaust second generation Holocaust survivors, and that's probably because we had to survive our parents' survival.
And yeah.
Anyway,
I told you folks, this one is very special to me, so I can't wait to get into that. But before we do, who was your favorite teacher or your professor and why?
My favorite teacher was my 6th grade teacher, Mrs. Sunshine, because I love the name. And my favorite professor was a guy named Kenneth Koch at Columbia. He was a poetry professor, and I never really appreciated modern poetry, especially until he showed me some lovely things.
Wow. And just the name Mrs. Sunshine.
Right.
Oh,
Yeah.
I see why. All right, final question. What's the one thing that you practice on a daily basis that improves your life?
I try to meditate every day. Usually from 10 to 20 minutes a day. My wife and I, or sometimes when she's not around, I go myself to the water. We live not far from Long Island Sound, and I sit by the water and try to sort of figure out as much as I can how I can still my mind.
Still like the water that rushes across the rock. That is absolutely Amazing. Thank you, sir, for walking us through those 5 simple questions. I told you they were easy, Max. I told you.
I know. I need easy.
Hey, now something that's probably not easy, but is definitely a direction that we're going to go. Walk us through your background. Take us on a journey from whatever point you want to the current. Just let us
Sure.
know.
Yeah. It's complicated. Stop me when I'm going too far with all this. I was born in Sweden, in a small town called Halmstad, in 1950. My parents had met there after their liberation from Bergen-Belsen, after their being in concentration camps, and after surviving 5 years or 6 years almost of the war and the Holocaust. Uh, we emigrated to the United States when I was just 2. My sister was 4.5, and we lived in Coney Island, and right across the street from the roller coaster and steeplechase and all the rides. We were never allowed to go on any of the rides. I never went on any ride. My parents were always afraid that we would be hurt, so we never did any of that. Uh, and then over time, went to school, went to Columbia. Uh, Fortunately, got a scholarship there because my family was pretty poor. Uh, and Met my wife at school. She was at Barnard. And then I decided I didn't know what to do with myself. I could write, but I wasn't really sort of dedicated to it. So I uh, did go to journalism school. I went to Berkeley, and this was in the early '70s, and so it was a People's Park time at Berkeley, and it was a rough and interesting place. But I did find that journalism was what I wanted to do. Uh, Came back. Uh, we had been married. Came back to New York. Got a job at a little newspaper, and then found that I was not patient for the experience of going from small newspapers to mid-sized newspapers to large newspapers, then to maybe magazines or somewhere else or broadcast. And I started looking for other writing type jobs, and I had 8 or 9 before I sort of settled in, ultimately in public television for about 5 years. Worked for Bill Moyers, uh, had a strange and interesting experience going to the White House with him when Jimmy Carter was president, and calling my wife from every from the president's from the Oval Office and saying, "Guess where I am now?" Then I would go to the cabinet room saying, "Guess where I am now?" And it was a little childish, but it was quite an experience. Uh, uh, Left that because we had twin boys, and I needed to make more money. And I went to work for Bristol Myers, and I became head of communications at Bristol Myers, which was a large drug company, was also a consumer products company at the time. I stayed for 20 years. I also did a lot of freelance writing on the side because I felt that I had sold out somewhere, so I needed to feel good about myself. So I wrote book reviews for the Chicago Tribune and other things. And in any case, left there when I was told that I had to fire half my staff, and I asked to be put on the list. And I left after 20 years and started my own little editorial consulting business. Did that for about 15 years, and then passed the last 6 years writing my book and researching it.
So that's really interesting. Usually at this point, I start to go into leadership style. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that you just gave us a huge nugget. So when they asked you to lay off half of your staff
Right.
and you chose to put yourself on the list.
Yeah, I had been there for 20 years. I had sort of gone up at least half of the ladder, or quarter of the ladder, or wherever you're going. Uh, and I knew a lot about the company. I knew what was going on in the company, and I thought that there were lots of other ways to deal with the issues. And this sort of peremptory approach of just, pick, and there were about 60 people in my group. Uh, so I just said, I really don't want to do this anymore. I went to the medical director and asked him for a prescription for Xanax and said, if I have to do this, and I was told that I had to do it myself in one day, sit in a room and just keep calling people in. I said, if I have to do this, then this is the only way I can do this, is to not even let them know that I put myself on the list, but because by putting myself on the list, I actually saved 2 or 3 jobs. But just to let myself know that I'm not going to do this again, and then take care of them as best as I could, and talk to them as though we're all sort of in the same place, because we sort of were.
So you actually didn't tell the people that you were firing that you were on the
No,
list?
no, because that wouldn't be fair to them. Uh,
Taking it off of them
I
and putting it
don't.
on you instead.
Yeah, and also, well, look at me, the hero, or look at me, the good guy, and I mean, I'm telling them very bad news. And it's sort of their time. It's not my
Yeah.
time.
Where did you develop your leadership perspective? Like who was the greatest influence on you for that?
I think I for a number of years before I got to Bristol, I didn't really have much of a team. I was sort of on my own doing various things, or sometimes 1 or 2 people. And this suddenly I had a large group of people, and then it got actually larger with more and more responsibilities. And I got to like those people, but all along, there were always people that just didn't make it, and wouldn't make it, and you had to have these difficult conversations with them, which I didn't enjoy at all, but neither did they. Uh, and you started to have a perspective about other people, and that sort of led me, I think, all along to what my book was actually, because it's about trying to develop empathy. And I find that even when I would talk about the book, which we'll get into later, uh, what I try to do is introduce the characters, my parents and other people, and show their pictures as much as I could find those pictures, and show and try to make them real people, because we talk about the Holocaust, we talk about 6 million people, and we talk about all this stuff. And until you actually list their names and the dates, the first time I found out my father's first family's names and the names of his children and how old they were when they were murdered, uh, it's totally different. And so the idea of empathy and the idea of being in other people's shoes, even though there are a lot of other people you don't want to be in their shoes, or if you were in the shoes, you wouldn't make it. I always have felt that way about my own parents, that I would not have survived. I really don't think so. Uh, but but at least you get to feel them. You get to feel these human beings, and I think that was my leadership, was about never doing anything that I didn't wasn't willing to do myself, and always both teaching and also learning from them, because they had their own stories and they had their own backgrounds, and it's not just up to me to sort of lead them around.
Yeah.
They have to lead me
Yeah. And
too.
I think that when you put a name to someone,
Right,
there's automatically, I mean, if you're human and you have a heart, it becomes a connection.
right.
And so it's not necessarily that you're forced to like them, but now you're connected in a way that you can't you won't
Right.
forget.
It's hard. It's hard to say I don't care about you.
Mhm.
I don't care about who you are, as just because you're just another, and that was actually what had happened to those in the camps. They were given numbers. They were
Mm.
never called by their names, only by their numbers. they were not human any longer.
See, and everyone remembers 6 million, right? They remember the
Right,
number 6
right,
million. The
right,
names is
right,
always very difficult. I mean, the most famous one I think that we can obviously think about, Anne Frank, right? They know
right, right.
the Anne Frank story because it's embedded in our education system to learn that name. And Otto
Right.
Frank, and the different members of the family.
Yeah.
So when you put that name to it and you characterize them and you give them life through the words, you have to feel some semblance of connection, and in the same way in leading. So I think by you being the one who took your own job, you were in part doing the exact same thing. You were remembering who they were by ensuring, that their story was continued throughout.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting to see this perspective, because we know what the Holocaust was about in large part. We know what it was about. I would like to get into a little bit more of the resiliency side of it, because your parents survived.
Sure.
Uh, what or how would you define spiritual resilience?
Yeah. We were talking about this before. Uh, I would have to try to think about resilience and spiritual resilience in a more practical way than the words would imply. As spiritual is a belief outside of yourself, usually religious or some other faith or some other way of looking at the world beyond the sort of practical. Uh, and resilience, sort of usually comes along with lots of other words like perseverance or uh, adaptability or finding sort of positive ways of looking at negative things and things like that. And again, I have in my own experience, not so much my own in terms of my own life, but my parents and their survival. Uh, there was a different kind of resilience that they were able to find, and and the spirituality was a belief system, but not for my father. Probably religion and faith in his God. For my mother, she believed in herself. I mean, I think at the end of the day, she saw herself as the survivor and throughout her life was faced all kinds of hardships, well, even before the Holocaust. Uh, and so she the spiritual part you wouldn't see, but there was a belief system. It was a fantastical in the sense of otherworldly, a fantasy life. And she believed in a fantasy life rather than a spiritual life. But it was not the life around her. It's the life she believed she either should have had or decided to believe she actually did have. And that pulled her through some extraordinary times. And my father as well, who was much more grounded in reality, uh, came to believe things that in fact were not true. And the book looks at the stories that they told me and then the stories I found to be actually what were.
So is it a
And
reflection between their perspective and reality?
it's a reflection between what they could, if they didn't believe what they came to believe, they couldn't have survived the guilt, the shame, the the loss. And so they came to believe other things about their experiences. And my mother would tell us those things, unfortunately, a lot. My father only mentioned one story about his past in all the time that he was alive. It was a 20-minute discussion
Mm.
uh, about his story and what allowed him to go on during the camps and then afterwards.
So your mother was more of this is what happened, and your dad was more of a, this is what kept me going.
Yeah, you could see it. I mean, he didn't describe it in that way, but you could see that if it were not for the story that he came to believe, he would not have survived.
Wow. And now,
So it's a strange little line that you walk around, but they're both it forced them, or it allowed them to be resilient. And for my father, it allowed him to open himself up to faith when I think he had lost faith.
wow, very, I really cannot wait to read this book. So I'm super
Mm.
excited about it.
All I could say to you is when I asked my publisher why no one read my book on Amazon this week, because you could find out. Uh, she said, and it was the summer, and she said, Max, this isn't a beach read. Uh, you don't take this to the beach and
Yeah.
escape. This is not an escapist story, but it is, I guess, hopefully a compelling story, and more important, a story that people can look at and think about their own, how they see uh, coming up against an existential threat, and how would you react
Yeah,
to that?
100%. So now for yourself, having grown up with these
Yeah.
two parents, and
Mm.
developing your own definition of spirituality and spiritual resiliency,
Mm.
how does it manifest in your life? What do you do to build it up?
I think the main thing I've tried to do with our children and with our grandchildren, I guess, uh, is to give them a sense of possibility, to give them a sense that there is so much in the world that we don't know about, that we need to meet, and sometimes we need to accept, and we need to explore, and we need to find out, and it all comes down to how we see ourselves and what values we hold dear, and what we think we can accomplish, even in our small parts of our lives. Not for and if you can instill that in kids as a young, which means really asking them to believe in themselves, and also asking them to believe that they don't know everything, or maybe anything, and they never will. And the journey is finding out. And the journey is accepting a lot of things that you might not think to accept. And the journey is understanding that there are other people in the world who may feel very differently, or who are on their own journeys, and they're very different. And you have to just be flexible, and always sort of uh, try as best you can to make sure that you're doing what is right for you, but also what's right for other people too.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because you want your kids to experience, you want them to be out there, and I think that you all did it right, and you need to experience it yourself. Was there anything that you didn't think you did right in that?
Oh, too much, too much. You go back again. I'm 72, going on 73, I hope. Uh, and you wonder, well, what went wrong here? What could I have done differently there? And the other thing I always used to tell my kids, and I have to start telling myself more, is you have to forgive yourself.
Mm.
You're not a perfect person. You don't know what the future is, and you make believe that you know a lot.
Yeah,
You don't
I
know
I
that
never
much.
have to remind my wife that I'm not a perfect person. So she helps
I
me in
know.
that every single time.
There you go.
So she's a great partner though. So I'm good. I've been yoked with someone that is better than myself. So that was the journey
Me
that I
too.
took.
Good.
So give us a moment when you had to rely maybe more so rely on spiritual resiliency alone in order to make it through something.
Well, I guess one thing that we would do is we would go. My one of my sons moved to China, and he married someone there. They married there, and they married here. They had a kid, our first grandson, and they were living in California, and then they moved to China, and he was only about 2. And we really did not enjoy flying to and from China as many times as we ended up flying to and from China. And everything, it was a difficult journey. We would stay for a week or so, and then we'd go back. And after a while, we just sort of said, we really don't want to do this anymore. Uh, but we came to rely on our grandson, and he came to rely on us, and he came to know us, and we came to know him. And one day we decided we're just not going to do this anymore. We're just going to take the next flight out. And instead, we took a walk and we bought some ice cream. And we said to ourselves, but what about our grandson? Where will he be? What will he think? Did we abandon him? Did we, uh, we have so much more we want to do with him. What's that going to be like if we just don't do this anymore? And we just sort of came back and we said, well, we're just going to keep doing this for a while longer until he's old enough to understand things, and he's old enough, as was the case, to actually travel by himself, which he started to do when he was 7. And he would fly to the United States, as an unaccompanied minor. We would meet him in other parts of the world where he wouldn't suffer too much jet lag, and we wouldn't either. And we did that, and he's actually living with us at the moment, going to school here. So he's 14 now. He was much younger then. And so it was a matter of deciding again about something other than ourselves, and how could we do something that would be good for us, because we would miss him and we would feel that a big hole in our heart for not having him with us. But think about him, not about us. And that, I think, is resiliency, to the extent that you have to be adept at sort of dancing to different tunes all the time, and spiritual, because it's certainly not about you. It's not a belief in yourself. It's a belief in someone else and what somebody else wants and needs, and that requires certainly a spirit inside of you that is selfless, not selfish, and empathetic, and I don't know. So it was resilient because it came up to us very quickly, and we had to make some decisions, and it was decisions that, for that trip and for future trips.
Well, and it seems that you have made the correct choice, especially for the moment, and come on.
But we're
Yeah,
happy with it.
absolutely. So the book. The book is called
Yes, the book.
Painful Joy. Two
Right.
contradicting words. Kind of
Yeah.
kind of take us through the book. What was writing it like? And
Yeah. Well, writing it was I guess a painful joy in and of itself. Uh, the book title comes from a poem that was originally sort of formulated by I guess a Jewish sage in the Middle Ages, and it was about what kind of love can exist when the love is touched by death. And so it seemed to me the right poem to take the title from, because basically my parents met after the war. They both had been married before. My father had 2 little girls. as well. Lots of family, and then they met in Sweden in a camp there for survivors, and they fell in love, according to my father, within 3 days
Hmm.
of meeting. And somebody once said that another way to define love is the absence of loneliness, and they were lonely, to say the least. They were alone in every respect, and so it seemed like the right thing to do, because their love was touched again and again, and certainly for the years that they were in Europe, by death. And so the question is, what kind of love comes out of that? What kind of love comes out of survival? And that's what the book sort of tries to portray through the stories, and it's a story that I didn't want to tell. I didn't even want to know about till I was about 65, 66. I stayed away from their stories. Uh, I didn't know most of it, and the little I knew was just so sad and depressing. I didn't want to know more, and so we never would talk about it there with them, except to the extent that my mother would talk about the concentration camps a lot. So uh, the book came when actually my grandson asked us about survival one day, what it means to be a
Wow.
survivor. I had talked to him a little bit about my very difficult mother, and I had said, well, she survived some very bad things, and so that's why she had a difficult way of looking at the world, and that affected us as children. And he asked, well, if they were survivors, then was I a survivor as their son? And would his father, my son, be a survivor too? And therefore, could he be a survivor one day if
Wow.
he had to be? And I said, oh, I don't know, I guess. And then I said, but I don't even know enough to tell you anything. So I started yeah, to try to find out who they were before the war, whether they always were survivors in a sense, and what happened to them during the war. And that took about 5 years to
So
actually
how did you
figure out.
go through the process? I mean, you had the resources there all this time, and then your grandson comes along and asks you the question about Survivor. How did
Yeah,
you?
it was very strange. I had coffee with a friend of mine, and I mentioned to him that I'm thinking about writing this book, and I don't even know where to begin. And he said, "Well, I sort of had a reunion with some people. He grew up in South Africa, and he said I had a reunion with this guy who I hadn't seen since I was in high school in South Africa, and his son runs a Holocaust study center in
Oh,
Germany."
wow.
They're not Jewish. They actually were not German, even they were Austrian. And he may be able to help you. And so I sent him an email, and we had a FaceTime. And he started telling me the 10,000 things I should start doing and where I should start looking. And that's what I did, because we had no papers, we had no records, we had nothing. They had all been destroyed in the war, they never had gathered. And it was a long journey. We went to Sweden again. We went to Germany. We went to Poland. We went to Israel and where we discovered that my father had a niece, and we met with her, and she actually worked at the Holocaust
Oh,
center
wow.
there by chance. So it was a very strange journey, and we went to Auschwitz. We went to uh, I mean, it was a horrifying experience, but it was also an extraordinary experience, and it was the first time in all those years that I would actually say to someone that I would meet in any of these places that my parents were here, or they were. We went to the little villages where they grew up in
Wow.
Poland. So it was an opportunity or necessity for me to admit my past to myself, and to learn all kinds of things, and also learn that there are so many things that I would never learn.
Now, your mother was in Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen.
Yeah. So yeah, my mother was, yeah. So she was in the Krakow ghetto. Then she was in Plaszow. If you or anybody who listens to this has seen
Mhm.
Schindler's List, uh, you would actually know most of her story, because Schindler's List follows the people who were lucky enough to be saved by Oskar Schindler, but he also all the others who were not saved but were in those same places as those people, including even Schindler's factory, uh, was where my mother was and her
Wow.
family. So it was all in Krakow. So from the ghetto in Krakow to Plaszow, where uh, Ralph Fiennes plays Amon Get, who's the horrible guy who shoots people from the windows, which were things that my mother would tell us about when we were 3 and 4 years old.
Wow.
Uh, but anyway, so that's her story. So she was in Plaszow, and from Plaszow she went to Auschwitz. From Auschwitz she went to Bergen-Belsen. My father was in slave labor camps. Uh, he was in another part of Poland, but he was in slave labor camps, and then he went to a camp called Bunzlau, which was in Germany, and then went on a death march to Bergen-Belsen, where he ended up.
So you said that they met in Sweden, correct? They didn't actually meet in Bergen.
Yeah, so yeah, Sweden, as you know, was neutral during the war. Uh, uh, but I think they felt that they had to show, I don't know if the word is remorse, but they had to show that being responsible in some way, because Sweden was actually untouched by the war. They came out quite economically powerful. Uh, but they sent the Swedish Red Cross to Bergen-Belsen to take about 6,000 or so Jews who were in Bergen-Belsen back to Sweden for 6 months to recuperate in camps that were set up for them. And then they were supposed to leave Sweden and go somewhere else, wherever they decided they could get to. And my parents had nowhere else to go, actually.
Mm.
So, or at least my father had a relatives in the United States who had left Poland in the 1920s, but uh, the United States wasn't letting any of the survivors in after the war. So, so they met at one of these camps, and they got married the same year. My sister was born shortly, I mean, a while after that, then I was born. Then we left.
Wow. Absolutely just it's just powerful to think about. You said what kind of love comes from survival.
Oh yeah, it's a very
How long
different
were they
kind of
married
love.
for?
Well, they were married for the rest of their lives. So my they were married in 1946, and my father died in 93 of Alzheimer's, and my mother died in
Wow.
98.
You know, we
And
talked beforehand a little bit about this. Um, at the age of 14, the same age as what my son is now, we went to uh, Dachau, and it was the first
uh,
concentration camp I had ever gone to. And this bratty 14-year-old child, just talky all the way through. You're driving through the town, and it's absolutely the most beautiful, lush colors, green everywhere. Um, and then you drive into the parking lot, and you get out of the bus, and you start walking towards the camp. And all of a sudden, it's like the colors just start to fade away, and it goes into this gray abyss almost. And you walk into the camp, and it's completely gray. The rocks are white and gray. The walls, the buildings are this color. And it just it just seems like all of life has been sucked out of this specific part of the world. And it's just
Right. Yeah.
to hear the story that you have of your mom and your dad not knowing one another, leaving pure hell to go recover somewhere and to meet and yet stay together for all of those years past. That is a love I don't think that you can define.
Yeah. It was certainly a complicated love because there was so much trauma, physical trauma and mental trauma that was never treated either. Uh, so it was a very difficult life for them with each other, with us. Uh, I think in the book we were their
Mm.
child parents. They couldn't really take care of us. We had to take care of them. So we would wake them up from their nightmares. We would try to sort of deal with their arguing about everything and anything. We tried to calm them down. Uh, then they relied on us to be other than who they
Mm.
were, and they poured everything into us, and that's true for lots of refugees and families and things like that. But in a way that was extremely complicated and and left good
Now,
marks
do
and
you
bad
get
marks.
into the story or the thought trail of being second generation Holocaust survivor?
Yeah, so half the book is about what I found out about them and the stories that they told us and what of those stories were true or not true or partially true or but stories which I believe they believed after a while. And then the other half of the book is about what it was like growing up with them. So my sister and I, and what scars were left, and what good things happened as a result. So it's sort of half, almost exactly half is a journey uh, with them and otherwise of
Well,
theirs.
I like the photos. I think the connectability between who I am as a human and who they are as humans or were as humans really it really meets in that moment of being able to look at those pictures and be able to see the front cover is beautiful, with them on the bike and what
Yeah,
it. So
yeah,
I'm really
yeah.
grateful for what you have done in providing that story because that's a journey that you needed to go on to be able to learn and to understand. And I applaud your grandson for asking the question.
Oh yeah, yeah. If he hadn't done it, I don't know. I had lived long enough without dealing with it. Why I could. There was enough else going on in our lives. It was okay. But to take that and try to actually find out, and then try to understand what it was like, possibly when one never could know what it was like for real, but to to suddenly face a world. I mean, the world was never easy for them in Poland, but one day it was one world, and the next day it was an upside down world, totally different.
Mm.
And to face those kinds of threats, and I mean, we faced our pandemic here, and sort of crazy politics and all kinds of other stuff, but to face this sort of life and death threat and not even realize just how serious it is, because I think they they were used to a difficult time. They were poor, they were Jewish, and things were always tough. Uh, but they were not used to and they didn't believe that what would happen, and that I think is that's the operative point of being open to all possibilities, not necessarily prepared, but at least being a little more tuned in to what the world is around you than I think they could
Yeah,
be.
the potential
Anyway.
of human, the upside and the downside of what could be.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Well, absolutely amazing. Max, do you have any final words that you would like to share with the listeners today?
No, I think that I mean the book tells people what I found, and I think the takeaway that I had is that we all tell ourselves there are always stories, and everybody has a story, and everybody has many stories, and we all tell ourselves stories because we want to believe those stories, and they start to define our lives. They sometimes become central to our lives. And I would just say that we we should be careful about those stories. I think sometimes we need them, but sometimes they control us instead of us controlling them. And you'll see the stories that are in there, and they're and the book is, I guess, heartwarming, but it's also heartbreaking. And when you see what people go through and how they adapt and how they have to adapt, it just is a reflection on things that you can learn more about yourself, and not that anything like that hopefully will ever happen again, but the extremes that they had to deal with, there are gradations of those in our lives all the time, and to see that they can be surmounted, uh, there's always a price
Hmm.
to pay.
Have you ever thought about going back to Coney Island to ride the rides?
Oh, oh, I went with my wife. We went on the Cyclone when we got engaged, I think. Uh, I really don't like roller coasters. I didn't mind missing that. She likes it a lot. And our grandson and granddaughter and our at least one of our
Well,
sons
I'm
likes it
glad
a
you
lot.
did that at
Uh,
least.
Yeah, no, yeah, we've been back to Coney Island a few times, and it's an experience too. It's changing as well, but uh, going back in time and trying to say, well, this is what happened then. Sometimes it's better to leave
Yeah,
well enough alone. Uh, but other times it reminds you of things, and
yeah,
it's not a bad
and it
thing.
makes you appreciate just
Yeah.
a little bit more.
Yeah, it says how
Hmm.
far I've come. Yeah, and how far there is still
So,
to go.
where can people purchase the book? Where's the best place to get it? Amazon?
Amazon, 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 and
Amazon it is.
Amazon,
All
and
right. I
Amazon, and
will put a
Amazon.
link in the
It's
description below about that.
yeah, okay. Hardcover, softcover, Kindle, whatever you like. I didn't do an audiobook. I think if I did an audiobook, I'd put everybody to sleep, and that
Well,
would
it
be
would
the
be
end
your
of it.
soothing voice, Max.
I know
All
exactly my
right,
soothing
Max
voice.
Friedman, thank you for investing into us today. I am truly blessed that you took the opportunity, that you took the time to sit down and have a conversation. You're going to be hearing him more on more and more podcasts. Be sure to check him out. Today's episode is only possible thanks to my friend and producer, G. Frazier, with 369sounddesign.com. He is truly the one with the hardest job, Max, because he gets to make you and me sound amazing. We are blessed by the entire team here at the Wartime Leadership Podcast. See you next time. Be blessed.